Should Mass Effect return to its somewhat linear roots? I kind of think so. What I mean is I prefer Mass Effect the way it was over the vast majority of the main trilogy versus how it became in Mass Effect Andromeda, and would like to see BioWare revert and modernise that linear/semi-linear approach rather than double down on Andromeda's semi-open world approach. And I use the word semi because the trilogy isn't fully linear, nor is Andromeda fully open world, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Anyway, allow me to explain my reasoning. About a year ago I made a video regarding how Mass Effect 1 constructed its world in such a way that formed a captivating lore-rich environment full of atmosphere, yet held on to cosmic horror aspects that sold a sense of mass scale far greater than one's comprehension, without ever losing focus and delivering an experience that resonates with me to this day. I never followed up with the respective videos about how Mass Effect 2 and 3 sold the world further, so I thought I'd make a crack at doing that in part today, though with more future-oriented mindsets. You see, Mass Effect has only had 4 entries and yet subscribes to 3 different philosophies of world design over that short course. Mass Effect 1 is a very focused narrative experience entailing several fixed locations and many planets you can land on and just feel the emptiness and atmosphere broken down by the occasional bit of something to see or do, combined with more linear segments to carry the narrative. If anything, it's aided by the technological limitations of its time in that respect. Mass Effect 2 and 3 are very similar games to a degree, in which the world is established to ensure you soak in as much storytelling as you can, without ever feeling as if you're being pushed into a scenario in which finding it becomes too much of a hassle, utilising a semi-linear approach to grant the player a sense of gigantism in a game that isn't really that big at all. Arguably, 3's take on this approach was a bit complacent by comparison to 2 at least, but you get the point. Andromeda then focuses on providing a handful of worlds where you can land on, with these large, visually detailed world spaces in which the narrative then occurs. The side content and main content occur largely within the same spaces, with the odd exception, but it really falls flat because in doing this the sense of scale is thrown completely out the window and the focus and pacing is diminished and various story beats get cheapened. And this brings me to the purpose of this video. Mass Effect 5, or whatever BioWare wind up calling it, is being teased every year because they probably jumped the gun on announcing a game they shan't release for a good while yet, but I'm not the one to pass judgment there. I'll take whatever Mass Effect news I can get. Anyway, I wanted to explain why Mass Effect 2 provides perhaps the most ideal approach to world and level design that we've seen in the franchise yet, and deliver a piece of content that highlights how I'd personally like the future of Mass Effect from a position of world design, construction and establishment to actually be. So why does this video matter then? Well, in short, it doesn't. It's a YouTube content creator with a pretentious script talking about a game he likes, and if that isn't a good enough reason to watch this video, you probably don't need to. However, in a world where the AAA gaming market is dominated by the nonsense of a fully open world being the answer to innovating game design, I wish to express why such a route, the route taken with Mass Effect Andromeda to far greater degrees when compared with the trilogy at the very least, is perhaps not the way forward for the Mass Effect franchise, in my meaningless opinion. Though, I have to say, I don't dislike that game anywhere near as much as I used to, I just don't love it anywhere near as much as I do the trilogy either. This video is inspired by 2 key factors: an end 7-day teaser for the next Mass Effect installment, which is still likely years away, but that happened a few days ago, and recently having sunk 200 hours into Starfield, that though I liked, I didn't like it anywhere near enough to feel as if deep down I don't want those hours of my life back. Starfield is a game that takes on the idea of an open-world spacefaring RPG in which you can land on over 1,000 planets that on average probably have less detail than the small selection of planets you can find in Mass Effect 1, and at times, though they sold a feeling of emptiness by design, were a bit bleak in content, but there was always something for those who cared to look, whereas the same cannot be promised in Starfield. The comparison is a bit pointless and bloating, but I promise it'll make sense. In order to sell an idea of scale to the extent a space adventure open world game might require, one must do either one of 2 things: make a game that is unnecessarily massive and use procedural generation to fill in the blanks to the point where it feels as if the actual content is filling the blanks between loads of procedural generation and not vice versa, like your evening meal consisting of one tiny potato and a mountain of textureless gravy. Or go the Andromeda route and only give a handful of actual spaces within this universe and severely limit the experiences that can be had. Or you can opt for the other solution altogether, and that is to utilise very simply performed illusions afforded by the notion of a more contained, semi-linear approach in which the open elements are open enough to make you feel as if you're playing in a crafted world, and you can tackle a lot of aspects outside main story beats in varying orders without the added stuffing of being able to explore massive spaces of not very much. Focusing on just the areas you need to make an open world space game is what Andromeda did with several worlds you can land on and extra linear bits elsewhere, but it felt a bit stunted and isolating when you're treading over the same terrain several times over the course of the main storyline, only to do the same in a lot of the side content. It's an almost competent game, but it didn't scream Mass Effect 1 reinvented, which is probably what the game was admirably attempting to replicate. The Mass Effect trilogy approach wasn't quite lightning in a bottle either, but it's certainly the most competent in conveying this environmental richness, contrasted by unimaginable vastness, all while remaining focused and on track, which is the key point, and it'd be a shame to see that lost in the event that Andromeda's small open world spaces route got adopted going forward instead. That's not to say if it does go the modernised route of small open world spaces on each world we can visit, the game will suddenly be a dumpster fire. There's room for that, and it is possible to get right. However, the galaxy is a massive place, and the semi-linear approach is a great way to convey that the only reason you go somewhere is for one purpose, and then you'd be massively unlikely to retrace your steps on many occasions, of course with exceptions. Which is how Mass Effect 2, especially, and 3 while we're at it, is presented. Mass Effect 1 is more the open area route, but in a game from a time when technological limitations allowed for that to function in a focused manner in which you're unlikely to need to retrace your steps and visit the same location 60 times. For varying unrelated objectives, which is what Andromeda suffered from on occasion. Mass Effect 2 is the better example for overall world design in my mind, even if 1 does handle certain aspects a smudge better, so we'll be focusing on that. In this game we get several hub areas which are small, such as the Normandy itself, and small areas of civilization on Omega and the Citadel, as well as Ilium and Tachanka, and that's really kind of it. Everything else is a perishable limited access linear corridor shooter, which exists to serve as a backdrop to the mission you're interacting with at that given moment, whether they be main or side content. As a result, the openness of Mass Effect 2 is small and probably comprises less than 5% of the total areas you can visit over the course of the story, and all the side missions besides. There is content in the hub areas, but it's much more acceptable to find yourself visiting the same location over and over again if it's a civilized centre or somewhere you'd be reasonably expected to return to, rather than the middle of nowhere in a new galaxy where you'd realistically not expect to encounter several quests involving the same spot, versus where you plausibly could. The vast majority of the game taking place in linear segments relevant to only what the story beat or side mission requires is a quality that makes Mass Effect 2 feel far more massive than it actually is. It allows for us to experience more in a condensed game, and it allows for us to see more and explore more without having an open space filled with not very much at all for us to navigate in between one fleeting collectible and the odd bit of light environmental storytelling, as is the case with many open worlds such as Andromeda. Yes, my favourite aspect of Mass Effect 1 does boil down to having these small spaces in which we can rag the Mako and realise how absolutely terrible a driver Commander Shepard is, while soaking in the vast emptiness of the universe, and I'd never argue there's not a place for those elements in moderation going forward, just not as a limiting factor on where the content of the game can go and what you can do, which is an issue Andromeda encountered as a result of being able to encompass more actual content balanced by the fact the surface area of these regions needed designing by actual humans in a timely fashion, resulting in small spaces inside which loads of shit happens, so neither the sense of focus nor emptiness of the universe actually got satisfyingly captured. I think the semi-linear/linear approach of the corridor shooter Mass Effect 2 is the best way forward for a lot of the content, because it allows us to not be restricted to one world space or the next, using the power of illusions to give us the grand sense of scale, while also providing small, relevant sections to these canon locations that exist with purpose either to the story or the side content, which as a result of not being an open world, can be made far more relevant to what's realistically expected to happen, based on what else we know to be happening. For example, side content in Mass Effect 2 in bulk consists of things that you'd realistically expect Commander Shepard and his hearty crew to be involving themselves with in the build-up to taking on the game's main antagonistic faction, the Collectors. The main bulk of this side content would arguably be the squad mate loyalty missions you need to do. Every character who fights by your side has a request that you can aid them with in order to gain their loyalty, which is a bit odd. You'd think you'd have already had Garrus's loyalty, but I digress. This content is great because not only does it feel essential to the story being told, it feels like extensions to the main content rather than being derailed and going in the complete opposite direction. After all, you'd want to ensure your crew's commitment when taking them on a suicide mission, so it works out as worthwhile content that feels as if it works towards the main narrative's end goal, when the reality is it may not. Mass Effect 2 does definitely reward you for sapping the side content, and it can just as easily punish you. But that's besides the point altogether. The point is, the side content actually feels relevant in its focused presentation. Areas that you can go to for the vast majority of the main and side missions outside random interactions you can have in hub areas are crafted with the purpose of serving that particular part of the game and nothing else. The game has a core story with which it can push you onto the side content, a lot of which was initially locked behind expansions, which I would not like to see carry over into this elusive, mysterious Mass Effect 5, or whatever subtitle they wind up slapping on it. The core story then in return rewards you for this extended interaction with the overall game by giving you more favourable options, more context to characters and more chances of success, without ever feeling as if the game holds your hand or forces you to go out of your way. This is because the experience is made incredibly concise by its linearity, and mission markers are entirely unnecessary because the focus is made clear through careful crafting. This doesn't mean we aren't free to tackle side content in whichever order pleases us within reason, and it doesn't mean we can't take off and find content entirely unrelated even out in space. You need to scan worlds and probe them constantly in order to mine materials to upgrade the Normandy, for example, which may lead you towards encountering anomalies on planets that may provide you with an opportunity to land on said world and uncover a small piece of storytelling in passing that has nothing to do with the main storyline of the game, but justifies your being present because you literally need to sap the universe dry of resources to upgrade your ship for the best possible endgame outcomes. The system wasn't perfect for reasons I think I just summarised. Who wants to spend hours on end-firing probes at every planet in every star system in the game? However, the concept is solid enough to the point where you stumble upon most actual content somewhat naturally.
Really, Commander? Probing Uranus.
Beyond that, there are plentiful interactions in the hub areas that release in chunks depending on where you're up to in the story, which makes returning to them feel fresh, and sometimes these areas do overlap with the crew's loyalty missions, but you're never confined to the small areas when there's actually something going on that runs deeper than a Krogan wondering if there are fish in the water on the Citadel's Presidium. In my opinion, this system worked best for Mass Effect. There's room for open spaces on barren worlds away from the noise of civilization, allowing you to feel the vastness of the universe like in Mass Effect 1, whilst bouncing around in a shitbox six-wheeler of doom and encountering surface-level environmental storytelling. But largely, the semi-linear stroke linear approach allows for the most content, world building and lore to be condensed into the least unnecessary game bloat, which is where more open world oriented games can falter, not that they necessarily will as a rule. Mass Effect 2 had its limits, but those limits weren't in how much of the Mass Effect universe we got to see. I could say the same for Mass Effect 3, though I feel as if the cut down on small hub areas made it feel far more linear than it needed to without being too different to 2 in reality, but it was far from a bad thing within itself. And those limits are it's a linear game technically, though I reckon the appropriate term is perhaps semi-linear, and the world linearity seems so old that games you'd never expect to go open world since have, like Halo or Ghost Recon. not that I can fathom entirely why. However, the positives of being concise, of going for less to accomplish loads, really speaks to the handcrafted care that Mass Effect 2 thrived on. Every detail, every piece of information, line of dialogue and piece of missable content that can only be experienced in that moment made Mass Effect 2 thrive, because it wasn't really a game about choices, but rather about attempting to get the most out of the game by actually interacting with everything it had to offer, leaving no stone unturned, no hidden room undiscovered, no dialogue option unselected. The game doesn't feel like it's dragging itself out to artificially inflate your overall playtime, but it also isn't rushing you to hop between one objective and the next, or between points A, B and C all the way to the other end of the alphabet and beyond. The game ensures you're never far from the detail, but you never feel as if the game's world as a result is far too small, because it's not. It's just organised to prioritise what's actually important to the story being told and the feelings it wants you to experience. You being where all the shit is happening is because you would be. You're just cutting out the fluff. In an open world format, often you'll just be travelling haphazardly between point A and B, after the 16th time paying little to no attention to your surroundings. In a linear format, at least outside of the old-fashioned level layout, you only experience the vast majority of locations a game has to offer the once, so every area, every character, every line of dialogue and missable detail, and every visual on top is a part of that event. It's a much less compromising and far more organised line of delivery for what Mass Effect prioritises as a universe, and that is of course telling a coherent, deep story in a diverse galaxy full of possibility. Now, that lore-rich, immersive storytelling RPG that is Mass Effect may have done well in the original Mass Effect 1 format modernised, which was sort of a mixture of the linear and non-linear areas, but Mass Effect 2 feels far denser in its substance without being stretched into a disproportionately long game, which is a quality I can only express my liking for with regards to this brand. I'm not saying there isn't room for that Mako tomfoolery from Mass Effect 1, there certainly is, and I'd never argue that Mass Effect should be fully linear, because that's not quite what I'm getting at. In my opinion, Mass Effect should stay largely linear. Even 1 adheres to this, albeit to a less strict yet no less precise degree. It was just a smaller game in a time where you couldn't get away with something being too huge, resulting in more compromise in order to give the player something to chew on whilst balancing that focused storytelling. I'd say Mass Effect 1 is my favourite Mass Effect game, but it's also the only title of the trilogy I'd say has aged in a way that matters. These days, video games are unimaginably gigantic for reasons that don't entirely escape my understanding. I'd imagine all that disk space a game eats up is done with ultra high definition textures, massive world spaces, realistic graphic fidelity, and complex mechanics, not to mention patchwork that makes these ridiculously, inefficiently gargantuan file sizes actually function, and I don't imagine the topic of linearity versus openness as a fundamental approach to overall world design resolves that as such, and I'm also aware that it's a far more complex topic than one that can be satisfyingly covered in a linear mindset, ironically. This is purely a point on how I'd see the next Mass Effect game being focused and oriented to allow for the most relevant richness to be experienced in one game without adding copious bloat to the mix to entrench the game with pointless shite and natural restrictions that don't work so well for spacefaring adventures. Mass Effect Andromeda tried to go the more open world route with several world spaces of respectable map sizes and lots to do within those areas, but it significantly reduced how much we actually got to see, limiting how much the environment could be tailored to any one thing, and how much there was to make us feel like we were actually exploring in any meaningful way. There were arguably markedly less unique and inspiring backdrops because you could now visit them whenever, including locations specific to certain quests. As a result, these experiences felt far less special because you'd seen the damn place earlier, so you already know it was there, and nothing about being there is actually unique at all and doesn't aid the storytelling in that moment. I commend the effort, and Andromeda isn't without its linear segments, and in my mind actually gets better when it focuses its world spaces to specific missions and events and set pieces, but Mass Effect has far too much feeling and impact to formulate over the course of just one story to ever be reasonably reproduced by 4 or 5 decently sized open world spaces you can mull about in until they fade into becoming generic. In my mind, it needs that precise corridor aspect that allows for you to see countless worlds and places to accent the storytelling specific to that very moment, rendering the experience rewarding rather than feeling like a chore that becomes all too familiar when slogging through the middle section of many open world games out there on the market. And I wish to clarify, I don't dislike open worlds in gaming at all. In fact, I very much so like them, especially when they're executed well, and if the next Mass Effect does have a more open worldy approach and nails it, I'll happily put my words in an egg and cress sandwich and eat it. However, I feel as if this franchise consists of far too many dimensions for an open world to truly thrive and work in tandem with the philosophy of the brand to convey what the game needs. Mass Effect is a science fantasy spacefaring adventure. In that genre, the idea of an open world falls largely into two categories summed up by both Mass Effect Andromeda and the recently released Starfield. Mass Effect Andromeda loses that sense of scale to a debilitating degree, focusing on a mere handful of worlds with supposedly lots to do but very little to see and experience after a while, undermining the sense of exploration the game intends to focus on. Starfield, by Bethesda Game Studios on the other hand, resorts to procedural generation to allow for you to land on over 1,000 worlds, with very little to absolutely nothing going on outside randomly generated landscapes, flora, fauna and generic outposts, and the actual content gets lost in that to the point that you could argue it isn't as fun as it could have been, undermining the sense of exploration again, albeit for entirely different reasons. You experience the same thing 20 times in about as many minutes, so what are you actually exploring and why should you care? Therefore, it would be reasonable to conclude that perhaps the best approach for a game that relies this heavily on intricate storytelling is to resort to a largely linear format for us to experience, though not necessarily without the open aspects where they fit either, as demonstrated by elements and ideas possessed in Mass Effect 1 that 2 and 3 don't have. But for what Mass Effect specifically requires, I feel as if the open world core blueprint demonstrated in a lot of what Andromeda did is far too imprecise, whereas the core sort of linear focused approach of the past allowed the world to constantly be moulded around what this particular moment needed it for, relying on the illusion of massiveness to allow us to see it in realistically bite-sized chunks based on when it might become relevant, allowing for every location and story or side mission moment to feel crafted with the utmost care and attention, without all the added fluff that could risk rendering the entire experience unrewarding for one reason or another. A risk that open worlds inherently carry, because that space, that location, is now somewhere you can go whenever, which means it either always needs to contain the detail you need it to, or it needs to not be too heavily detailed as a means to not spoil a narrative point you are yet to reach, and either way can erode the impact of the moment when you realise it hasn't all been crafted with that specific event in mind. With autonomy over a reasonable portion of ordering, especially and perhaps exclusively with regards to how you approach tackling side content, is all Mass Effect 2 required to feel far less limited than it perhaps actually was. And the illusion and feeling in an artificial world space is perhaps more important than being able to tackle an environment in a more literal scenario as seen in an open world game, because it's still an illusion, nothing that's going on is real, and that illusion is attempting to convince you either way. What actually gets the job done depends on what the substance requires. I won't pretend Mass Effect Andromeda's open world aspects were anywhere near that game's biggest problem. That game's primary issue was at no point did it give us a reasonably decent reason to actually care about anything going on, but it definitely didn't help its own case because it didn't feel like a convincing illusion of a real lived-in universe, but rather just a generic open world-ish game set in space. The set-piece aspects to the game were far more engaging, only let down by the fact that we didn't really have a reason to care, and then that would be broken down by hours on end of monotonous open world stuff in between the good set pieces. So though you felt the impact of those set pieces, it's because you're acknowledging the format that works as a condiment to the format that doesn't. Some games work better as open worlds, others are best handled in a more linear format. Mass Effect 5, or whatever it happens to be named, I'd imagine there'll be some mad subtitle considering there was no officially titled Mass Effect 4. In my opinion, should retain that semi-linear format that Mass Effect 2 and 3 enjoyed, though some natural quality of life improvements and enhancements would not go amiss either. For example, as funny as probing Uranus was, maybe less probing would be ideal. Another area where Mass Effect 2 and 3 do falter a little bit in my opinion boils down to the substance of the hub areas. This is where I envision the needed open world aspects for Mass Effect being slotted in. Especially with how many years it's been since, you can definitely get away with going beyond simply elaborating just enough that the point is conveyed all the time. For example, it would have been nice if there was more to the Citadel for us to explore, in one single game anyway. And with regards to Mass Effect 2 in particular, you could definitely make the same argument for Omega or Ilium. These dense sprawling locations are the best place to concisely deliver locations that can be traversed without too much emphasis on rhythm, in a place that doesn't compromise the game reveling in tight, focused set pieces. And since you can't possibly convert all of these locations as envisioned into game form, it wouldn't reduce the possibilities for locations that are specific to moments. Because everything that can happen within a specific location might not occur within this open area that you have access to, meaning it would basically be what Mass Effect 2 and 3 do already, albeit expanded that you don't see everything an area has to offer inside 5 minutes of arriving. And yet upon seeing everything, it retains the fact that it doesn't feel literal, which is where Andromeda struggled, because when you've done everything in that game, there are no blanks for your imagination to fill, because there's no feeling that what you're exploring is only a small snippet of what's actually out there. As for those small world spaces on largely barren planets in Mass Effect 1, they do get a lot of stick for being empty, even though there are some cool things to find if you look for them. They never subtracted from that game's more linear segments, in which a more focused and specific atmosphere could be generated. That said, I'm neither here nor there on whether or not these return to some small degree, just to give us the opportunity to drive the Mako again, or something like it. But as long as they don't limit how much information and world building the game can encompass, in my mind there is certainly a welcome space for these assets. How BioWare moves forward with this is entirely up to them. I can only voice my opinions online, and I am under no illusions that anybody's going to listen to that, and nor should they necessarily. But in my mind, Mass Effect functioned best as a largely linear experience because it allowed us to experience more, further using the world building to make us feel as if we hadn't experienced very much of everything there could possibly be. And I just hope that that isn't lost in whatever comes next. Anyway, thank you all for watching this video. I know it's been a bit of a ramble by design. I do hope that you've enjoyed it, and if you did, maybe leave a like and hit subscribe if you want to. I can't force you at gunpoint or something. But look, I'm going to leave this video there. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. Let's keep it respectful, but there's always room to hear everybody out, I suppose. Beyond that, I'll see you all very soon with another video at some point. But until the next time, take care and goodbye.